Okay, Vince, I'm going to introduce you and you turn the show over to you. Let me say a few words first. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Wilson Science and Technology Forum. There's an old saying that is attributed to George Santana. It says something to the effect that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I kind of like the more popular variation, which is something like those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Well, we're lucky. We're lucky, folks. We have a Wilson Forum historian, Vince Dixon, who's going to educate us a little bit on a very important moment in American history, and that was Evacuation Day. Uh, Vince is well known to all of us. I don't think I need to say anything more than Vince, it's good to see you again, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you, Ron, and thank you, everyone. We've had some interesting little technical bumps here along the road. So today you actually see me in person or on the screen, a whole variety of other things. But this is a time of the year where people hear something about St. Patrick's Day and a few about Evacuation Day. But there's a lot more to it than that, and this presentation will look at that, and we will get started here. How do I toot the screens? Where's okay, this.
Just a second.
Okay, hang on.
Yeah, a little technical help. There you go.
Uh,
The screens will be up in a minute, I think.
yeah, are you guys still seeing the screen share?
We see a green screen with nothing on it, John.
It's not green. It was hiding behind.
A second, let me try one other thing. Oh, no. Says we are screen sharing,
Oh,
but
that's
is that
There you
good?
go.
okay.
Yep.
Evacuation Day is a lot more than just a minor holiday. How it came to be that is something we'll talk a little bit about. And Wilson Science and Technology Forum, and of course, the fact that we have so much science in Massachusetts, in part, is from a fairly early point where Massachusetts had been a leader in education, and in the 1800s goes forward at that point. And at another point, we'll talk more about it. But it's striking. We don't have a screen on this, but if you know Lexington Green, about 250 yards northeast of it, there's a large wooden frame building. And in the early 1800s, that's where the first normal school in America was, which is the first place where people began to teach teachers to teach, which became the universal education system eventually across the United States. And another example, basically going back to the sense of independent action and self-government that we'll touch on with the events that happened at this time 250 years ago. The 250th anniversary has had some interest, and I have actually wound up overlapping. I think two of your number have seen one of the other presentations. This presentation is meant to be a little more scientific and interpretive, with a little finish at the end for present day events. There was a full-length presentation at Sanborn House to the Winchester Historical Society, and there is now a Vince Dixon show and local access that is being shown in Winchester, Stoneham, Melrose, Woburn, and online. And there's that's a condensed version. For those who want to try good pronunciation, this is the semi-quincentennial, the half of 500, the 250th anniversary, and this set of events right around what most people think of as St. Patrick's Day and what is Evacuation Day is the last major one that's just Massachusetts, though there is some national representation. And of course, July 4th is when everyone else kind of kicks into America's 250. Observance is part of it, celebration. What a great a set of achievements, and reflection on how people got here. A prior presentation to Wilson Group was heading towards America's 250th. We'll touch on that briefly as I've done some further analysis, and as we look forward, there is much to consider. People know a few basic events in whatever history even taught here in Massachusetts: the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the battles of Lexington, Concord, and Menotomy, now known as Arlington, and the Battle of Bunker Hill. But actually, over a period of 11 years, there are 3 sequences of events and 12 distinct actual events, 8 others that are really part of this road to full independence. And so I call these the Massachusetts Independence 12. The foundation of them are a series of events where people are getting kind of angry. The British are not serving them well, are not paying attention. Local self-government is being ignored and increasingly restricted. The liberty to protest in 1765 was, in fact, the first observance of the 250th down by the intersection of Boylston Street and Washington Street in downtown Boston. If you look up in the of the traffic, you'll see there is a large stone bas relief of the original Liberty Tree. The spinning circle in 1769 in Lexington, where women shared in what are we buying British stuff for since they aren't letting us think or trade for ourselves. And that's where the term homespun came from, literally homespun yarn. Of course, the Boston Massacre and Tea Party, perhaps the least known and most important, the Suffolk Resolves. This is in September of 1774. Dr. Joseph Warren, the president of the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts, writes 19 resolves. They are reviewed by Suffolk County Convention. They're given to Paul Revere, who was doing the official business of Massachusetts. 5-day ride to Philadelphia, reviewed by the First Continental Congress and endorsed by them. Notice that Georgia did not send delegates yet, and the other states or colonies weren't there yet, but they endorsed what Massachusetts had done, which is literally to break loose. We're going to collect here in Massachusetts the revenues the British are looking for because we're the government, and really the British are now reduced to a few neighborhoods in downtown Boston. Lexington, Concord, and Menotomy is kind of the conclusion because this is the point where full-scale war is now underway. From that point in April, depending upon the day or the week, anywhere from 10 to 15 or even 20,000 militia and various groups are surrounding in the siege of Boston. And a series of skirmishes occur, 33 Boston Harbor Islands, many of which are being used to graze cattle or to raise hay or occasionally some other crops. And a British warship checking around and going up Chelsea Creek misreads the tide and gets stuck. The militia watching see this. They go after the ship that has to leave the ship. Its cargoes are stripped, the munitions and uniforms and all, and then the ship is set on fire. And so you have Massachusetts 1 and the British Navy 0 without having yet had a full Navy. The Battle of Bunker Hill, of course, the great casualties that occurred there. And the evacuation of Boston could have been a battle, but the British thought better of it. And so perhaps less dramatic to some, but that's part of why Evacuation Day may have been a little less paid attention to because nobody died in the siege activities and the planting of cannon at Dorchester Heights. Hundreds died at Bunker Hill, but the effect of what happened at Dorchester Heights is so much more successful. Then, of course, a lot of people say, well, remember, this is rule of law that we talk about, and we can't just have a provincial Congress of Massachusetts, a governor's council, and military commanders. We don't need that anymore. And so a constitution is required or ordered. The legislature produces one, and people say, wait a second, the legislature shouldn't be doing that. It should be a convention of the people, which was assembled, met at the church in Harvard Square, a committee of 3 that turns out to be a lot of the work of a fairly dull but a competent workman, and that's John Adams. And He's the one who writes the Constitution we still have in force. An earlier one, the state constitution, had failed. So now they, I think, changed the name in part because of that, and partly harking back to the Commonwealth of England. So it is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And then the U.S. Constitution comes along, and people say, wait a second, there's nothing about people, it's about power and commerce. And so the Massachusetts solution or compromise sends out more than a dozen proposals with the agreement that they will be sent out to the states, and then Massachusetts will ratify this new constitution. And then a number of states follow in the Massachusetts lead, and 10 of those proposals become what we call the Bill of Rights. And so Massachusetts enables and defines how the U.S. Constitution itself will be passed. This exploration, part of history, occasionally you get compensated, sometimes you don't, but the little gems or jewels that you discover, and in this presentation, as we did it, we discovered Rufus Putnam, a military engineer, William Heath, a little-known major general, Montpelier House, the Henry Knox House, and Henry Knox Thatcher, who became a rear admiral, the grandson of Henry Knox. Civic literacy is a project that I've been developing. There is now a civic literacy law in Massachusetts signed by Governor Baker that is being implemented across the Commonwealth that requires civics internships, and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education is required to provide standards and requirements to local school districts. And so, in fact, history intersects with civics. History is how we got here. Civics is the operating manual, and they do create their own symmetries in terms of what we do in terms of our daily lives. In the Civic Literacy Project, we are developing further presentations, curriculum materials, publications, and other opportunities as well. And anyone who's interested, we're willing to take this Commonwealth wide. We've already escaped into the countryside near Winchester to some other communities that are carrying this the actual Vince Dixon show that I mentioned. Philosophies of government are important because people will say, well, I don't have time to think about this, but I like what X or Y says. And the original ones of the classical European or Western model, of course, Socrates, who taught Plato, who taught Aristotle, kind of like the three tenors. These are the three Greek thinkers who underlie much of the thinking that we still have in the West. John Locke takes a lot of these ideas. John Adams follows much of that, reads a great deal. John Quincy Adams, the son, follows that, becomes an early abolitionist. And of course, the influence of the Polish Brethren that winds up in Italy, a man who takes the name of Socinius, the Socinian view, that parallel to this and intersecting finds its way through the Frenchman Johann Couvin, we know of as John Calvin. Those views read extensively by John Adams and other thinkers and directly inform the sense of self-government that Massachusetts embraces from the earliest point with the Pilgrims in 1620, Massachusetts Bay in 1630, and a lot of others along the way. One other thing a lot of people sometimes forget is that philosophies are not just thinkers, but also either by themselves or intersecting with it. Deal with economics. So a lot of people know of labor and Marxian views, labor theory of economics. There's the capital views, Adam Smith and others, the wealth of nation. A third fellow who deserves equal billing, who we pay for if we have property, and that is Henry George and the theory of land value. And if you look at your property tax bill and your assessments, Henry George had a lot to do with that from the late 18 into the early 1900s. And a lot of planning people and zoning people know of this, and a lot of them don't. So when we kind of get that a sense of a framework of what philosophy and thinking is about, we have the constitutional development of Massachusetts, the Mayflower Compact of 1620, the Pilgrims blown further north from where they might have had some authority, say, well, we don't have authority, but we can contract with each other, and they write down an agreement, which really is establishing their government. The Massachusetts Bay Charter, which was formally authorized by royal authority in England, brought here. the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1630. The Oath of a Free Man, very early, interesting document because it talks about responsibility, authority, individual commitment of a free man and what they should do. Many other things along the way, but part of it is the Suffolk Resolves in 1774, a convention of about 80 to 90 men in Suffolk County, the document written by Dr. Joseph Warren, carried to the Continental Congress. And this is important for a couple of reasons. If you read the Suffolk Resolves, you'll see the Declaration of Independence in many ways echoes them because there are the grievances against British authority either being misused or ignoring local self-government, but also ideas about how to move forward. And so it's from this point that Massachusetts is independent, the Massachusetts Compromise being kind of the culmination of setting of this. So Massachusetts didn't stop when it became fully independent. In fact, it kept on going to this very day. At the local point, very early on, people were concerned not just about Native Americans, but sometimes some of the settlers were people who had criminal records looking for a new opportunity. And early on, local militias were created, and they had some characteristics we would see today, and that is local officers of local militias were elected by the members and referencing the local government of town meetings. And still today, if somebody is nominated to be a flag officer, a general, or an admiral in the U.S. military, they must be confirmed by Congress or they will be retired and not promoted. Many of the individuals with some limited experience or gained more with various British Army activities in North America, particularly the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. And George Washington was a significant example of this. The wilderness of Virginia, where he went out with Virginia militia and some British Army officers, wasn't too happy with that, but learned from that experience and went on to a distinguished career and some interesting sensitivities about the use of military and civilian authority and how they might intersect. This is, in fact, the current long-running armory at the top floor of Faneuil Hall. This is by the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company. And first Monday of June, they elect their officers on Boston Common in a pro forma exercise that goes back to the founding of this ancient militia group in 1638. They were the militia of Boston and remained so well into the late 17 and early 1800s, now primarily a fraternal group, but there is a public elevator, and between, I think, 10 and 3, 4 or 5 days a week, you can go up and see some tremendous history and archives. There were founding mothers, and interesting that as Massachusetts grievances grow and the use of free speech in various ways, that the top leaders, male and female, were actually relatively integrated. Martha Washington, of course, lived with George on Brattle Street in Cambridge. It was common for women of note and some rather ordinary women of no note to live near or with their husbands in army camps when there were fixed or relatively fixed lines. Abigail Adams, perhaps the best known, but Mercy Otis Warren in her time was very well known and is coming back to reputation and knowledge. Among many things she did was she wrote a play herself mocking the British royal governor that was performed live in Boston to great acclaim. Think about what that's like at a time when the average person of any rank was of no particular significance. She's actually taking on the entire establishment with great success, Phyllis Wheatley and many others as well. General Artemus Ward was a man who had earned a bachelor's at Harvard in 1748, a master's in 1751. His house in Shrewsbury was saved by Harvard some years ago. It's open to the public a few months a year. And Ward was really one of the early generals and then became second in command to General Washington, turning over his command. We'll talk a little bit about some more people in this regard. Ward became a major general in the Continental Army, but remember, Massachusetts is an independent state, an independent country, and so it is appointing generals and military officers who had some experience and some military training and had some extensive reading. And John Adams described Ward as being a significant figure, universally esteemed and beloved. These people had a close social connection to each other through positions of wealth, positions of power, and in the churches where male church members had a say about how churches ran. This is the house in Shrewsbury that was saved by Harvard by purchase. It has some interesting artifacts further out down near the town of Hudson. The siege of Boston was an extensive siege. Remember, 10, 12, 15, perhaps at times even 20,000 militia, largely from Greater Boston and Massachusetts, but fairly quickly from New Hampshire and some from other places as well. And as Washington arrives some months later and begins to form the Continental Army by the authority of the Continental Congress, and remember, there was the assumption that Canada would be part of it, hence they used the term not American Army, but Continental Army. So it confuses a few people. And so at some point, some decades into history on both ends, some people put up a small monument on Cambridge Common that notes this is where the American Army began, though it was known as the Continental Army. This is a view of Boston Harbor, and you'll see part of really an extensive network of rivers. On the south side, the Neponset River comes into this area a little further down. You have the Charles River, and you have the Mystic River, and these are areas that also have large mud flats, shellfish that can be harvested, fish that can be harvested. Native Americans had been doing this for centuries. When the different John Hancock towers were built and the foundations were dug more deeply, in fact, they found the remnants of fish weirs that go back centuries. So the Back Bay would flood during a tide, and then the fish weirs would catch the fish on the way out, and be an easy way, not having to catch the fish by rod and reel as some people do for sport. And you'll see on the south side where Dorchester Heights is, on the north side, actually northwest part is Cambridge and the campment there. And you can see how the British were hemmed in. Boston Neck is that thin connection, and that is the area of Roxbury, which turns out to have been much more important than people realize and has been noted, and a little bit of history of that has been brought to light more in recent years, as it really should. This is a broader view of the strategic and tactical dispositions and deployments on the northwest side. The military camp in Cambridge, the headquarters of Washington. You see the Boston Neck and the downtown area, and you see Watertown.
This meeting is being recorded.
So this is the battlefield area, of course, and this is important. You can see that at some point you have a stalemate between the British forces and the various forces of Massachusetts, now supplemented by the Continental Army that is coming into its own. The siege of Boston continuing, and British ships continue to supply.
I'm sorry. Somehow we have an echo. Someone must have a phone or something connected. I think it just happened a moment ago. Please turn it off.
Okay.
Perhaps
goodness.
everyone can mute themselves.
Let's see.
Are we testing?
Okay.
Hold on.
Ron, you can mute everyone individually.
Yeah, I'm trying. Hold on.
Are we clear now?
We should be.
Okay, thank you. There's still an echo.
I tried muting, and everybody's muted, so I think it's maybe
No,
it's
not everybody's muted. Martin is not.
Okay, we got the
I, I, I think you can mute
Now
only.
we're all set. Okay,
we're
go
clear
ahead.
now.
Yeah.
Okay, the siege lines are restored, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Fire
Thank
away.
you. Sorry for the little blip. So, backing up a bit.
Yeah.
So the thousands of British troops in downtown Boston, they had gone out actually on a series of foraging episodes. The first battle could have been some months earlier in Salem, where the British thought they could put some troops on some ships and pretend to sail out, and they sailed north, and then they came into Salem and marched through the town. Except since the Patriots had riddled the entire British network with spies, they knew the British were coming. And in Salem, there was a confrontation at a drawbridge between militia and British troops. The British realized that they couldn't do much in surprise that day. So it was agreed between the two gentlemen officers that the British would be allowed to have 50 men march across the bridge about 100 yards to say they had reached their destination, uh, and then march back to their ships in Boston. So there were other raids where they were seeking to find the militia weapons, to intimidate the local population, to grab a few people who might have been Patriot sympathizers. None of this really worked. And then you got Lexington and Concord, where, of course, gunfire was exchanged at Lexington and then Concord, and now full war is underway. But there had been this period of testing as the siege of Boston tightened. And meanwhile, British ships keep coming in. The government of Massachusetts, of course, now thinks of itself as the government of Massachusetts, which is the provincial Congress that met at Salem and then in Lexington, Concord, Cambridge, and some other places. And they authorized something very naughty for a state, and that is letters of privateering. So rather than having warships, great deal of commercial trade here in the port of Boston and in Salem North and in other places along the coast. And if it's a letter of privateering, if you seize a cargo, then that ship and its cargo can be sold at auction, and the people who seized it can profit directly from it, which is very different than a warship grabbing something and tying it up or holding it under rules of war. And it was fairly effective. Some people think as much as 25 to 30% of the British ships coming into Boston Harbor were seized, largely by Massachusetts authorized privateers, a rather curious term, uh, operating from the Salem or north of Massachusetts area. And it meant that British troops coming in, perhaps with only the clothes on their back, were repatriated to British lines, more lines to feed, uh, without the weapons, without the ammunition that went over to the control of the Patriot forces. So the British were partly supplying their enemies as well as their own. And so this is how the siege continues in a way that becomes rather a stalemate. And the siege of Boston Harbor, including the battles and skirmishes across the 33 islands. The Grand Union flag is a signal moment. Some think there may have been a version of this down in Pennsylvania at an earlier point in the fall. In any case, this has the Union Jack on it, but 13 stripes. And this is commemorated every January 1st on Prospect Hill in Somerville, weather notwithstanding, friendly or this past year extremely brutal. And there it is flying in Somerville was part of Charlestown held by Patriot forces. The British saw this and were, of course, suitably outraged. It raised the spirits of the Continental Army and the militia and enraged the British. And you begin to see here not just a country developing, evolving, Massachusetts and all, but symbols are important, and this was a clear example of that. The Grand Union flag, you see Grand Union flag kind of as a ceremonial or decoration on many homes these days. The importance of Evacuation Day is not just the events leading up to it, but the fact that, well, who's going to win this stalemate? Pretty large set of forces 10 to 15 or 20,000 Patriot forces, different periods of enrollment that might be 3 months or 6 months or a year. Continental Army gradually develops that further. The British were regular troops, perhaps as many as 8 or 10,000 at one point, perhaps 11,000 when the siege is near its end. Well, how do you change this? The cannon brought from Fort Ticonderoga, and there's a bit of pieces here that are quite significant. Henry Knox had run a bookstore in Boston, a rather high-end bookstore, was fascinated by military knowledge in those books, talked to many high-ranking British officers, and he proposed to Washington what could be done in many ways. And Washington was impressed by a young man who was in his mid-20s and what he knew, and put him in charge. And in November, sent him west. At Fort Ticonderoga, British fort, guess what? There were cannon. Those were seized, as we'll touch on just a bit more. And Knox is put in charge of bringing those cannon over 300 miles down New York and across Massachusetts. The transport was a remarkable strategic concept. How do we force the British out? We don't fight them. We bring cannon to force them out. Tactically brilliant, because how do you get cannon that length of distance without the Mass Turnpike, without diesel trucks, without the equipment we have today? And when those cannon were put on Dorchester Heights, some think, and there's evidence the British were thinking about an assault, but a strong nor'easter came in. It delayed British preparations and gave the Patriots time to further strengthen this surprise pop-up of a fort with cannon. And further British deliberation led to rethinking a possible attack, remembering the horrific casualties of Bunker Hill, thousands wounded, hundreds dead, led to the decision to evacuate Boston. The British said, well, we'll burn the town on the way out. And the Patriots said, no, you won't, or we'll shoot you in the back. And so a bit of a minor truce was engineered for about 10 days so the British would gather their forces and leave. St. Patrick's Day, of course, is March 17th as well. He is believed to have lived in the 400s AD, the 5th century. By the way, Washington had to have known of this, and surely did, because there was an Irish named officer of the day on March 17th. Original St. Patrick was a British youth kidnapped by Irish patriots, served for 6 years as a shepherd, escaped back to England, trained as a cleric, became a priest, eventually a bishop. This depiction on a stained glass shows the mitre of a bishop, the crozier of a bishop with authority. He had been a shepherd. Now he was a shepherd of souls. When he returned to Ireland, actually got along with the people well, and what is still regarded as the ancient Irish see of the Bishop of Armagh, and revered as a saint to this day. And even in one of the Orthodox churches, St. Patrick is recognized. We don't know for sure the St. Patrick's Day first observance in Boston, perhaps in the 1720s. We have to rely on anecdotal accounts. Remember Patrick, when he first wound up in Ireland, having been kidnapped, he was a British lad. Padraig is the Irish Gaelic version of the name, or Padraig, a simple Gaelic version. He was a youth. Maybe that's an important part of the energy and frivolity that has often been associated with the day. He was not just a religious figure, but he was an energetic young fellow who had a get up and go. And it should be remembered that the Gaelic people were and are one of the tribal cultures moving west across Europe, from Brittany, the Bretons, in France, to the Welsh, to the Scottish, the Gaelic Irish, and some other smaller groups. And this is somewhat analogous to the Romance cultures of the French, Spanish, Italian, and Romanian, and their significant cross-European cultural and political influences. The Gaelics known for being warriors and battle-tested, and having tribal cultures. The Romance cultures, perhaps to some, a little more civilized, but both ranges of cultures and local variations have influenced Europe for centuries. Evacuation Day Boston 250 is this year. Remember the events going back some years. This is the final one that is primarily Massachusetts-based. And on Tuesday upcoming at Dorchester Heights, the simplest way to get there is the Red Line to Broadway. There are buses that go along Broadway up near Dorchester Heights on Broadway. And there will be a church service at St. Augustine's Chapel, I believe, at 9, a procession up to Dorchester Heights at 11 with a full ceremony. The monument opened during the afternoon, a beautiful monument from much later in history. And this is not only important, but I quote from the National Park Service website that the departure of British soldiers from Boston signaled more than a military withdrawal. It restored hope to a people who had endured months of occupation and uncertainty, the end of the siege of Boston. From these heights, resolve replaced fear, and the idea of independence moved closer to reality. And you see the promotion of Massachusetts generals and officers throughout the Continental Army since the success had been really before the Continental Army was fully engaged. And in fact, Colonel John Glover from Marblehead and his boatmen that made the amphibious operations of the Continental Army possible, Henry Knox of artillery, General Greene, and others as well. This is the monument that was authorized in the late 1800s. Beautiful monument recently restored. I recommend going over there. The best thing probably is on a Saturday afternoon or even a Sunday afternoon. Parking is a little difficult in a congested neighborhood. It's near South Boston High. But if you park down along the beach area and walk up the hill, which is maybe about a 10-minute walk, it's probably the best time to see it. But you can also take public transit to that area. Some people say, wait a second, Dorchester Heights in South Boston. Well, South Boston was a part of Dorchester until larger immigration and residential construction built the more distinct neighborhood we know today. And this is an aerial view of the park. And General Thomas was part of the crew that brought the cannon in, so his name is on that as well. There has been some opposition to the Evacuation Day holiday on occasion. There are those who will mock it because they don't realize its signal importance. But think about the fact that these cannon meant that, in fact, a battle did not occur. Hundreds of Continentals, Patriots, Massachusetts, and British soldiers did not die in a battle as they might have or did at Bunker Hill. Governor Patrick was told, well, you can save some money. You're telling people to not work for a day in Suffolk County, and we could save that money and make them work. And some local people, Suffolk County district legislators and historians said, no, 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 it's still important. It is not, to be sure, and well known beyond here, but perhaps a restored view of history may bring it back. I notice, and it is of interest, Patriots' Day, originally thought of as just Massachusetts and Maine, has now been adopted by 6 states. And in the last decade or so, it's expanded. Nearby state of Connecticut adopted it. The state of Minnesota adopted it as a requirement for it Revolutionary War history to be taught in the schools. So maybe there's an opportunity here in a society where too often people are made to work 60 hours at 3 part-time jobs without benefits. Perhaps a paid holiday could be restored for something that can have some informative civic and historic value. There were, of course, anti-Catholic and anti-Irish forces in Massachusetts for a long time, and the opposition has been met by still an outsized group of elected and appointed Irish American officials, a kind of cultural jingoism by the Irish American community and community leaders. With respect to many of the pluses and minuses, I should acknowledge that though Dixon is a Scottish English name, on my father's side we were Cummings and Lynch and worked in the Boston public school system as teachers or other relative predecessors or librarians. So I guess as a historian, I'm doing a bit of teaching and a little bit of reference knowledge in terms of the stories of how we came to be where we are today. It turns out there was an evacuation day in New York City. a different date because the British stayed in New York City longer. 4,000 American slaves found their way to New York City, where they received certificates of freedom. In 1783, the British evacuated the last major port, and that was New York. And this was a major holiday in New York City, until the 1860s. Evidence suggests that the adoption of another Massachusetts holiday, Thanksgiving Day, by Lincoln as a national event of coming together, reduced the importance of Evacuation Day in New York City, which is now only occasionally noted. The New York City Evacuation Day, November 25th. You can see the calendar and the Thanksgiving similarity there, and you can see how Thanksgiving eventually shouldered aside the New York Evacuation Day. But still worth noting, because the evacuation by the British of New York was a signal event, a holiday, a great celebration. Washington paraded down the street into New York as the siege was lifted and American authority was restored to New York. Henry Knox, who was in charge of bringing the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, was born in Massachusetts. Maine was part of Massachusetts. Later in his life, with his wife, they built a home, which was eventually allowed into decay and demolished. But somebody who was a young girl who remembered that beautiful house said, "Why don't we build it again?" And funds were collected, and that is now in season the Knox Museum in Thomaston, Maine. And you see the beautiful structure that it is, really incredibly beautiful. Though I've not been there yet, it's worth a summer trip. I mentioned the Boston Harbor Campaign. We mentioned the Battle of Chelsea Creek, and livestock and hay, and there really were a series of skirmishes across the entire harbor. We mentioned that earlier. We mentioned Bunker Hill. And international commerce, local agricultural, local commerce, including slave trade, were part of what happened in Boston. During the War of Independence, because remember, Massachusetts already regarded itself as independent, so when the British are forced out, daily life largely resumes and evolves forward, whereas south of New England, in many cases, people are getting used to the idea of being independent and establishing local authority, which may not have existed. In New Jersey, in particular, they were used to waiting for royal authority, and so a certain amount of chaos developed before people figured out what to do. In Massachusetts, people returned to daily life. Boston Light was part of the battlefield. It was seized by the British or the Patriots, burned down 3 times, and rebuilt. We mentioned about the control of the Boston Harbor, which has 33 islands stretched out 7 to 8 miles. There had been, in going back and looking at the record, discussion by Washington and his command council about a ground assault against Boston proper. If you know where the Museum of Science is in Boston and Lechmere Square, the ground assault likely would have been along those lines from Charlestown into downtown Boston. These ideas suggested heavier casualties, and the bringing of the cannon, as I noted earlier, saved lives both among the British and the Patriot forces. Henry Knox, the officer, politician, bookseller, regarded by general agreement as a founding father of the United States. And later on, he also conceived of the Society of the Cincinnati, a hereditary veterans organization of the officers of the Continental Army that still exists today and is honored by many. There is a book of some interest and value, Henry Knox, a Soldier of the Revolution, Major General in the Continental Army, and Washington as Chief of Artillery. Along the way, an attractive, knowledgeable, and interesting adolescent girl began to hang out at the bookstore of Henry Knox. Her family was a loyalist family. They were very skeptical of her getting to know Henry Knox. She was 15, 16, 17. Actually, she finally married Henry Knox at the age of 17, and her family were loyalists, and they disowned her. She lost her family, but she went on to a long life of some significance. and a real helpmate to Henry Knox along the way. Much is made of the correspondence of John and Abigail Adams, and rightfully so, but there were other notable couples, especially at a time when wives often traveled to sites near the military encampments of the time. Martha Washington at Brattle Street, Lucy Knox traveling in many cases. The wives also helped to care for the soldiers who might have received casualties in battle or skirmishes at a time when there wasn't much in the way of the nursing that we understand today. The wives, even of top officers, oftentimes were really performing what we might consider as light nursing care, or sometimes even more than that, and inspiration and encouragement for the cause. Every cannon that was brought here from Fort Ticonderoga arrived in January of 1776 at Cambridge Common. There's a plaque that notes that. And their arrival electrified the Continental Army and marked a turning point in the siege. There was now a flag, there was cannon, there was fortification, there were generals, officers. It was getting to be a real army, and the British began to notice that opposite them were no longer just rabble and local militias, but something approaching a well-disciplined, trained army, and that's what they lost too. The Knox Trail from Fort Ticonderoga down through Albany, and as word spread, towns often came out and helped. It wasn't just horses and men, but also oxen that were stronger, and sometimes boats to get across fording streams. One cannon was lost in New York, and about 20 years ago discovered through some radar detection at the bottom of a lake and brought up and restored. Knox arrived in Roxbury along the way, if you're familiar with it, near the Basilica of Our Lady of Perpetual Health, or Brigham Circle. There's a church, the oldest wooden frame church in Boston from 1804, I believe. And that's now a Unitarian Universalist urban ministry. A beautiful church, beautifully restored. And they had an important ceremony in the last week or so. Here you see Clydesdale horses bringing wooden sledges with cannon on them to the location of this church. The original congregation from 1630s. John Eliot, who had been an apostle to the Indians or the Massachusetts people, who translated the Bible into it. And that Bible, since the Bible has quite a vocabulary, is being used to restore the Massachusetts language, the people of the Big Hill. The most striking thing of all, perhaps, is this great image, which has been through many decades, where Ethan Allen, originally born in Connecticut, knocks on the door of the commander of Fort Ticonderoga and says, "Surrender." The British officer basically says, "Who are you and what's this about?" And Ethan Allen very clearly says, "In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress." And those are the cannon that then become available for transport. There's nothing like using your own ammunition and weapons and those of your enemy that you capture from him. The outline and aerial view of Fort Ticonderoga, a restored site. My partner, Emily Ann, who's partly why we did a little different things technically. She's on her way to Syracuse. She vacations in upstate New York and has seen the site on occasion, and you see the Grand Union flag. The plaque on Cambridge Common where the artillery were delivered from Ticonderoga. A artist's conception of what that looks like or would have looked like, probably quite accurate actually, and particularly when you look at the oxen and the men in fairly ordinary but slightly matching clothes. Major General William Heath is almost unknown to most. He actually grew up in Roxbury, in the area of Roxbury Hill, and he wound up in charge of the militia and troops as they were gradually being trained and improved. And Washington didn't trust his lack of initiative, though he respected him at some level. But Heath turned out to be important to the success of all of this. Heath had been made a brigadier general by the government of Massachusetts. He commanded Massachusetts forces during the last stage of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Remember, as the British troops returned to Boston from their attempted raid of Lexington and Concord along the route of Massachusetts Avenue, thinking to go through Cambridge, finding their forces blocked, took a different route back into Charlestown, heavy fighting, and Heath helped to coordinate the militia rotating along the route of the British retreat in a way that increased the casualties, that contributed to the ultimate huge battle at Menotomy, what we call Arlington Center today. Notice that Heath was a major general of state troops, the government of Massachusetts. Memorial plaque we saw. The Congressional Gold Medal, by the way, comes about through this as well, since the authorized by Congress, the oldest official decoration. The design was sent to France because there was nobody really doing medals or coins here at the time. The historical continuity of this decoration to this day, and striking that the medals are carefully designed to commemorate the person or event being commemorated, originally of Washington. We mentioned, or are about to mention, Rufus Putnam, born in Sutton, Massachusetts, passed away in Ohio. He was called the father of Northwest Territories after the War of Independence and a leading figure in creating Ohio later on. During the siege that lasted with neither side able to make any particular progress, William Heath and Putnam talked. What do we do? How do we do this? William Heath said, well, you have experience with British military engineers during the French and Indian War. Let's build up to fortifications here in Roxbury and other locations. And by the way, there's a book here, Attack and Defense of Fortified Places by John Mueller. Sounds like a German name, that showed him additional techniques for building defensive fortifications. Putnam, by the way, Rufus Putnam, was a cousin of a better-known general, Israel Putnam. Using Muller's ideas and his own experience with building up these now impressive fortifications, the British had thought come out of Boston Neck and overrun them, and notice the fortifications getting stronger and perhaps too late for them to overrun them. Putnam devised a system that could be used for fortifying Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston Harbor. So despite the frozen and slippery ground of early March 1776, Putnam's plan of using timbers and fascines allowed the colonial troops to put up the defenses overnight, allowing for the subsequent emplacement of artillery. Putnam's success in establishing a fort in a matter of just hours took the British by surprise, left them in an untenable position, resulting in their evacuation. There were some short cannonades, and there was an expert who had some experience with the French who also came in and helped to refine the accuracy of the cannon that was being fired at Boston proper. And very quickly, the British realized they were goners, so to speak. Fascines is a way by which, kind of in a powered way, wood and brush and other material can be put together in a way that can strengthen a fortification, and this was being used as part of the building of further fortification at Dorchester Heights. This is a depiction of Washington by Gilbert Stuart, very beautiful painting. Some did not think it should be in proper circulation for a while, since you have the rear of a horse next to Washington, the great commander. But of course, this was hopefully a good horse, a good man, because this was a significant victory. And we mentioned the Congressional Gold Medal. This, by the way, there is a Congressional Gold Medal that was awarded to Washington in the Rare Books Department of the Boston Public Library. Senator Jack Hart some years ago brought this to light. And these, if you look carefully, the image on the reverse shows Washington and his generals on Dorchester Heights. At their feet to the right, the cannon and cannonballs that were available that the British began to see a few firing at them and decided they needed to get out. A close-up of the medal, close-up of the reverse. The man who designed the medal, and one for Lafayette as well, was of a family of at least 3 generations of medal makers in France to the royal family there, Pierre Simon Benjamin Duvier, and really incredible work that he did. And so this is one of the best medals that could have ever been produced at that era, or perhaps ever. Lafayette came along the way, better regarded during the anniversary that recent years where people have portrayed him. If you want to know why people just call him Lafayette or Marquis de Lafayette, you may or may not have learned in school that his actual name is Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert de Motier. Lafayette's a lot simpler. And he was an impressive, energetic man who brought much to the cause. General Thomas was also the general who, with General Ward, brought the men and the cannon. There were 59 cannon that were brought to Dorchester Heights. Unfortunately, on the invasion into Canada, he ignored the variolation requirements that George Washington provided. He knew about smallpox. Jenner hadn't yet created inoculation, which reduced casualties from smallpox to maybe 1 or 2%. But variolation, which involved taking some material from an infected person and scratching it into an arm, cut the smallpox death rate from 25 or 30% to 5%. Washington ordered that everyone be variolated. Thomas ignored that in terms of smallpox. He died with much of the army going to Canada, and assuming that Canada was part of the continent that we were going to claim, or our predecessors claim, Thomas kind of blew that opportunity, but he still deserves note for having been part of the effort that successfully brought the cannon to Dorchester Heights. And one of the British commanders said, those rebels, their army accomplished more overnight than I could get my men to do in 3 months. We don't have a known picture of Ethan Allen, who is the one who helped to seize Fort Ticonderoga. It is said that his grandson had a resemblance, but I have to research that a bit more and find a picture that really is a good picture of his grandson, if he was in fact resembling his grandfather. The Green Mountain Boys flag was the banner that was used. Remember, Vermont was an independent republic for 13 years before it joined the United States. Peter Faneuil is where Faneuil Hall comes from. We note it because Faneuil Hall was significant. There has been discussion of a name change due to his connections with slavery, but many of the people at that time, aristocrats and ordinary people as well, had many good things and many not so good things in their history. Thomas Gage was the last governor of Massachusetts, the Royal Military Governor, who really was perhaps a good man in the wrong spot and didn't understand his job. Eventually went back to England, and appears he never resigned as governor because he more or less had been the one blamed for losing Massachusetts, for losing America, if you will, at that stage. His wife, as even more important, Margaret Kemble, from New Jersey originally. It is thought she was a patriot sympathies, and one correspondent letter says that the secret, meaning the secret of the raid to Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, came from the heart of the enemy. And the suspicion points to Margaret Kemble having told President Warren of Massachusetts that this was going to happen. General William Howe, the British military commander, who was part of the British commanders, beautiful uniforms, good resources, well-trained, well-educated, who lost. Grandson, Henry Knox Thatcher, direct descendant, was appointed to West Point, fell ill, eventually wound up on U.S. Navy ships when he got better. And he summarized his service during the Civil War as special service, blockading, capture of Mobile, Galveston, and Fort Fisher, North Carolina. And really significant career commanding numerous ships in the Mediterranean. Ellen Knight, local historian in Winchester, this quote, some of Winchester's most honored residents during the latter part of the 19th century were veterans of the Civil War. Among these was the distinguished naval officer, Admiral Henry Knox Thatcher, who came to live in Winchester following his retirement. This is a picture of his house. He was, in fact, part of the story about Damn the Torpedoes. The actual story is similar, but factually just a bit different, like many. Admiral Farragut had tied himself to a mast to better observe the attack of the Union forces on Mobile Bay. Thatcher was cautious because there are explosive objects in the water, not really torpedoes, but an earlier form of what we would recognize as mines. When barrels in which they were in became waterlogged, they ceased to function. Farragut, knowing that the mines were really probably not that much effective, said basically, go forward, ignore what's in the water, later translated in several different ways by several different accounts. Essentially, Henry Knox Thatcher was being prudent. His commanding officer, Farragut, said to go ahead, and like the loyal officer that he was, he did. Mobile was the last major functioning Confederate port on the Gulf. It was freed. The economic lifeline thread that remained for the Confederacy was shut off. This is a brief map, if you know Lake Street, where you have the entry to the pond across from the Department of Public Works, and you see on this little patch here above the word pond, the word Thatcher. That was Thatcher's house. We mentioned the frozen ground and Putnam's plan of using timbers and fascines to put up the defenses overnight. This here is a picture of Putnam himself and the Northwest Territory, that he was involved in skirmishes and battles with Native Americans, whose territory he was horning in on, and eventually some of the developments of the government of what became Ohio. Crane currency is, if you look at your paper in your wallet or your purse, that Crane paper is made in Massachusetts. Some people didn't like the fact they make currency and have for generations here without any competition, it seemed, because the quality is so good. They make currency for about 70 other countries and nations as well. This is Dorchester Heights Monument, authorized around 1898, a Neo-Georgian style, and will be open some hours during the upcoming observances. And one of the Crane family became governor of Massachusetts, and he was the one who dedicated the Dorchester Heights Memorial. An academic note, it turns out that there is a lot more interesting and important history that is little known and should be. I mentioned the Patriot Army, from as little as 10,000 to as much as 20,000 people who came here from New Hampshire. Maine was, of course, part of Massachusetts, Vermont, Maryland, many Catholics, and many others, including some foreigners. And hence there were generals to supervise these larger forces, many individual stories, and all this leads to the remarkable victory. Considerable thanks and appreciation to my partner, Emily Ann Kernline, to John Brown, to Eddie, to Ron, and others who've helped explore some of our additional technical provisions. All ships, by the way, in our current effort will be coming to Boston, and this is, I think, of value and important for those people who may not have caught up on the latest news. The bicentennial of the United States, at the 200th birthday, there was a great convocation, and there's been at least another sail op, and this is just a small selection of the ships that have been invited. Boston will be the official port of sail for Sail 250, July 11th through 16th. There'll be a parade of sail. Most of the Boston docks and piers will have ships tied up that you can visit. And here's, of course, the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, newer destroyers that look a bit more like cruisers and have the firepower thereof, an Indonesian vessel, the Blue Nose of Canada, which has some history. This is Blue Nose 2, a copy of, a Polish vessel, and Evacuation Day holiday. Happy Evacuation Day. And though I can't see all of you, I thank you for listening in. Look at the National Park Service website. Consider going up to Dorchester Heights on Tuesday the 17th. Say a prayer to St. Patrick that he might guide us if you believe in that, or just wear some green and have a pint of Guinness, the best stuff that's made, perhaps not here. Thank you.
Vince, I just want to say that I think the word tour de force could not be more appropriate than in terms of your presentation today. That was
Thank you.
absolutely beautiful and informative, and I thank you for that. Why don't we quit the screen share and we'll have a conversation? I have a couple of
Sure.
questions, and I'm sure there are going to be some others.
And I hope you saw there were some new slides from the presentation you would have seen earlier this week.
Yeah, okay. Let me begin with a couple of questions. You mentioned the invasion of Canada. Now that has contemporary ring to it in terms of the interest of our president in Canada. But tell us a little about the interest in 1776 or thereabouts of the Continental Army in invading Canada. What was going on then?
Well, you remember that the French were a major imperial power in North America. The British were very late to the game, and it was a bit of a game because, of course, as many have said, the Native American people didn't have to discover North America because they were here and living here.
Yeah,
The in contact with European settlers or explorers had spread diseases and large numbers had died. So the wilderness, as it was called by many, well, though Columbus is often argued about for or against, it turns out about half of the European explorers were Italian. So you
yeah.
might recognize that well-known Italian John Cabot. He actually was not John Cabot, he was Giovanni Caboto
Okay.
from Italy, his son John, and they wound up with a employment for the British authorities, and they laid claim to North America.
Hmm.
The French used various explorers. You have many Italians, that well-known New Yorker Verrazano, um, eh,
Yeah.
Hudson. These were all people who were trying to figure out how to divide up this new continent that people 200 years before didn't much know about in Europe.
But in
So
addition, though, wasn't the Continental Army or the Revolutionary Army, weren't they interested in having some support from Canadian citizens for the cause in the U.S. in the
Well,
Valley?
you're right, and there's this is kind of like a chessboard. I mean, there's two
Yeah,
pieces. One is that
yeah,
the French dominance came to be a
yeah,
threat to the British,
yeah,
maintaining what we called
yeah,
the United States, and so they gradually fought wars and grabbed
yeah,
parts of Canada and eventually overran the French in Quebec. And so the Continental Army, as it came to be called right off, was assuming that what was British would be independent because, after all, we're all North Americans.
yeah. That's
You
exactly what I was
remember
thinking.
the
Yeah,
a few years ago, NAFTA was North American free trade.
yeah,
It is the United States, Canada, and Mexico. There is a kind of cosmology there. And so why wouldn't the Continental Army assume that? And there were other allies being looked at. The Native Americans in Nova Scotia, the Micmac people had some problems with the British for a while. And in fact, the first treaty of a newly independent state was with Massachusetts, yet again.
yeah.
Many years, there's a Treaty Day celebration in the summer in Watertown, and Native Americans come from Nova Scotia, and a treaty was written between the Micmac people in the Maritimes of Canada, agreeing to supply 200 braves to the support of Massachusetts and the patriotic effort.
Good,
So
good.
there's a continuing effort. It was the failure to variolate the troops, wherein when the troops reached Quebec and Montreal, of every 100 troops or so, the British might have 70 or 75 troops healthy and able to take the field, and out of every 100 Continentals, maybe 15. So no
Okay.
matter what the Patriot forces were, that had achieved surprise.
Yeah,
They weren't healthy enough to win the battle,
yeah.
and their subscriptions and enlistments ran out. And so ultimately, the Canadians have followed us in terms of self-government while establishing different local mentalities. There are maritime connections, there are financial connections, there are agricultural connections. For those who wanted to dig into that a little more, There's a great book about 30 years ago called The Nine Nations of North America, which
Okay.
looks at the Maritimes of Canada and New England as one country, the Northwest Territories, Alaska and British Columbia as another country, and you get a sense of the dynamic, the national border between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Those borders, until recent years and a certain amount of jingoism, didn't really mean much.
Yeah, let
As
me
the
let me let me
colonies
turn the
evolved.
conversation. Let me suggest two things. Vince, if you could raise your screen a little bit because we can only see your bottom part of your face. Just raise this,
Okay.
stand back. That's perfect. Okay.
Okay. There, thank you. Yep.
Okay. So let's go to Eddie and then we have Avi. Eddie?
Yes, well, talking as a Canadian as well as a Brit. The Canadians have a kind of different view of what happened. At least I'm not a historian, so I don't know if it's true. But
Okay.
apparently the Americans attacked across the lake and were completely exposed. And the Canadians didn't understand why they were attacking because they were so exposed and were shot down. This was a town near Kingston, I think it was, and it seemed like to the Canadians it was whoever was commanding was a bit nuts. But anyway, maybe that's a bit of history from the Canadian side.
Okay.
I just wanted to read something that I picked up. I think it was in Quincy. And this is to do with the women of the revolution, you might say. And I'll just read something here. It's a letter to John Adams, March 31st, 1776. In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. And there was another one, another letter to him. We are no ways dispirited here. We possess a spirit that will not be conquered. If our men are all drawn off and we should be attacked, you would find a race of Amazons in America. So that was a farmer, writer, and patriot. I don't know.
Those are
There's
quotes
no
that
name for it.
Eddie correctly quotes two quotes of Abigail Adams that are well stated. Um, of
Ah,
course, there's a lot more to it than that. Of current note is Quincy has decided, together with other people, to create what will be an Adams Presidential Center. It will have a building, it will have a site that will go together with the historic sites. There's vast archives that we still draw from of John and John Quincy Adams and their wives, who were first ladies of the United States and quite significant to the success of their husbands. The reference in the Michigan area to the skirmish and Canadian border, there were many, and people don't always understand. But self-government ultimately is what comes back to what all this is about. And the Adams were very important to that. And go online, look at the Adams Presidential Center. They're doing one or two public events a year. One of them looked at the role of those two first ladies who were extremely important to the success of John and John Quincy Adams in their presidential agendas. Former General Dunford, who is from Quincy, was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is leading the effort. Former Republican Lieutenant Governor Kerry Healy is on the board. It's really, and they're developing strong programs in democracy and civics that we've had the opportunity to sample, and I would encourage people who need the inspiration. Here's a couple of unambiguous Adams families who still can inspire us today in those kind of words that you read.
Makes sense. Avi.
Well, first, I guess I want to echo what Ron said. I found your talk fascinating. I mean, the amount of knowledge and detail you have is terrific. And it reminded me again that, we even those of us who think we know what happened in those times, we sort of have a vague idea what happened, but not nearly a sense of the complexity of what went on and how difficult it was. Almost a civil war between the loyalists and what are called the patriots. So it's just remarkable how much has gone on and how little we know about it. With
Yeah.
regard to Canada, also not well known, I guess in general, is that in the War of 1812, same players on the stage, we invaded Canada with we just had the Louisiana Purchase, and we thought this is a good time to annex more territory, and we lost that war. The Canadians won, and I know if you go to Niagara on the Lake, Fort George is still there from that time, and I've been there. So it's not a working fort, but it's used for ceremonies and weddings, etc. We had remarkably good relations with Canada, considering that we have invaded them a few times, although recent events, even without an invasion, have caused that to fray. If a question I have is that in the talk that you gave, maybe there are a few of them, but I wonder if there was any seminal event that if it had gone just the other way, like we talk about the Battle of Gettysburg and Pickett's charge, and if it had just gone a little bit the other way, the war would have ended up differently. The Civil War would have ended up differently. I wonder if there was anything in your recounting of what happened in Boston and Massachusetts where you think if there was one thing that changed ever so slightly, the whole outcome would have been different.
Well, it's a good question, and there's many potential answers. Those of us who've explored this in greater depth tend to think that April 18th and 19th, for some reason, have this sort of weird magical reality in the cosmos. And remember, April 18th and 19th of 1689, after 3 years of authoritarian rule by Sir Edmund Andros, an attempt to create the Dominion of New England, to reduce town meetings to minimal entities of barely local recognition, let alone government. Andros is met by the militia. There's disturbances on April 18th of 1689. The royal governor says, I might need the help of the militia, which is the ancient and honorable artillery we have as a fraternal group today. And they agree to meet with him, and they arrest him and put him in the fort in Boston Harbor, and they resume the charter of Massachusetts Bay to themselves. From the English London perspective, that charter had been removed and no longer had legal effect, but the people of Massachusetts, understanding self-government, resumed it. An older man who actually knew that history and had been an early Puritan who was a more sagacious and a good leader became the president of Massachusetts in 1689, together with a council of safety. So what is created in the 1700s really is copying what was done in 1689 to restore self-government in defiance of London and really ignoring what London did. So when the 1770s come along, they know what to do. Somebody says there's a king and they have authority. We just ignore them and we restore our local government to ourselves. If you didn't have that history of April 18th and 19th of 1689, which accidentally gets repeated in 1861 when Massachusetts troops are on their way to the defense of the U.S. Capitol and the first human casualties in Baltimore, Maryland, or more recent years, people who are not friends of our freedom, like the Marathon bombers. It just seems to keep happening around April 18th and 19th. And I advise people, watch your safety around that time and learn the lessons that ultimately it's our own self-government, it's our own self-sense of preservation and respect that John Locke, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, and many others would translate from the ancient Greeks.
So,
You
so
know, I think, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, we have our own Ides of March, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Beware the Ides of March, right?
But I mean, I think your question is fascinating, Avi. Yeah, I have to admit, Henry Knox is my hero. I just think what Henry Knox did in delivering 60 tons of cannons from Fort Ticonderoga all the way to Dorchester Heights in the dead of winter,
Right.
had he not been able to do that, we would not have had evacuation day, in my judgment. I just think he's the hero of this whole situation. Vince,
I agree.
how do you react to that?
Well, notice the other generals. I mean,
What? I'm sorry.
notice the other generals. I mean, who
Oh,
would
yeah.
ever really celebrated Rufus
Yeah, yeah.
Putnam Rufus Putnam was the guy who figured out how to put the cannon up there
No,
overnight.
I agree. I
You know,
just think though that
brilliant.
that was
These are
a
people who were
seminal.
willing to self-teach
Yeah,
the arts of war, regardless of the fact that opposite them were battle-tested people who were well-educated and had money.
yeah, yeah.
It's the
I
American
agree.
can do.
I do.
How do we do something? How do we do something that can't be done?
Yeah. I just think that's such a monumental accomplishment on the part of Knox and his gang of however many
It's
to
And
do.
you can
Putnam,
imagine
it's Knox,
all the
it's General
naysayers,
Heath.
all the people who say you can't do it. You lose
Yeah,
the cannon,
he
but he
did
got
it.
through. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Good.
Well, Vince, I want to thank you. We're right on time. I wanted to give you the last word, and I want to thank you, and I also want to thank John Brown and Walter Hubbard. We did have some technical problems that we had to solve before we came on the air this morning, and John and Walter were absolutely wonderful collaborators and partners and all that. So we owe them all a big shout of thanks. And Vince, the same applies in your case. This is a monumental presentation. I thank you for that. But
Well,
you,
thank you, and thank you to all the faces, the known, the lesser known, and Avi goes back with me decades, I know. And I'm doing media in a slightly different way than you did, but it is media because it's
yeah,
public education. And I think even when I didn't always agree with Avi, what he brought to it was not what all media people do, and that
yeah,
is to what are some of the questions we should ask about what it is we hear. And
yeah,
that's crucial. If we don't ask the questions, we're not going to learn more, and we'll just hear what we're told and perhaps be off base.
yeah. Well, again, everyone, we'll be back in 2 weeks. Our speaker will be Aaron Pressman, who is the technology innovations writer from the Boston Globe. He'll be with us on the 27th, and I look forward to seeing everyone back then. Again, thanks everyone. Have a
Thank
good week.
you.
Take care, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cheers.